attendants welcome to a quiet corner of history, where the echoes of ancient Rome drift softly through the steam of forgotten baths. Tonight's story will guide the mind through marble halls and warm mist, uncovering the secret routine of Roman bath attendants, the silent keepers of luxury, gossip, and ritual. As the candlelight flickers and the water ripples, this tale will reveal what truly happened behind the grand facades of the Thermae. How attendants prepared the baths before dawn, the hidden codes of service they followed, the whispered conversations they overheard, and the mysterious rituals that unfolded long after the crowds had gone. Across 5 chapters, each filled with vivid detail and quiet discovery, the story will explore the daily rhythm of these unseen workers, their tools, their secrets, and their place in the vast machinery of Roman life. Let the calm narration and gentle pace carry the mind toward rest, as history unfolds like a dream. Before the journey begins, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, so that more forgotten stories may find their way to your nights of peaceful sleep. Chapter 1. The Steam Before Dawn Part 1. Before the first rays of Roman sunlight touched the tiled roofs of the city, before senators began rehearsing their speeches and merchants started shouting about olives, there was already movement in the baths. Not the elegant kind of movement one imagines when thinking of Rome. No, this was the shuffle of half-awake attendants dragging buckets of water, the clatter of bronze tools, and the occasional curse muttered in Latin that would make even Jupiter blush. The Roman bathhouse, or Thermae, was not just a place to wash. It was the ancient equivalent of a gym, a spa, a social club, and a rumor factory all in one. And the attendants, the balneators, were the invisible gears that kept the steamy machine running. Their job began long before the first nobleman strutted in wearing his best toga and pretending he didn't notice the slaves doing all the work. The first task of the morning was to awaken the hypocaust. Now, that word sounds like something out of a bad science fiction movie, but it was actually a brilliant Roman invention, an underfloor heating system. Imagine a network of brick pillars supporting the floor, with hot air from a furnace circulating underneath. The attendants had to crawl into these narrow, smoky spaces to feed the fires, ensuring that the caldarium, the hot room, reached the perfect temperature for the day's bathers. It was a job that combined the grace of a contortionist with the lung capacity of a chimney sweep. The hypocaust was powered by wood, and lots of it. Rome's appetite for hot baths was so enormous that entire forests were sacrificed to keep the empire's citizens comfortably sweaty. The attendants, of course, were the ones hauling the logs, stoking the flames, and occasionally singeing their eyebrows in the process. There was no glory in this work, only soot, heat, and the faint hope that one day, maybe, someone would invent soap that didn't smell like goat fat. Once the fires were roaring, the attendants moved on to the pools. The caldarium had to be hot enough to make a senator sigh with satisfaction, the tepidarium, the warm room, had to be pleasantly mild, and the frigidarium, the cold plunge, had to be cold enough to make even the bravest Roman question his life choices. Balancing these temperatures required skill, timing, and a deep understanding of Roman plumbing, which, by the way, was far more advanced than most people realize. The water came through lead pipes, or fistulae, which were connected to aqueducts that carried fresh water from miles away. Yes, lead pipes. And yes, that might explain a few things about Roman emperors' decision-making. The attendants had to monitor the flow constantly, adjusting valves and clearing blockages. A single mistake could turn the caldarium into a lukewarm disappointment or the frigidarium into an accidental death trap. By the time the first patrons arrived, the attendants were already drenched in sweat, soot, and possibly regret. They had prepared oils, towels, and strigils, curved metal tools used to scrape dirt and oil off the skin. The strigil was the ancient Roman version of a loofah, except sharper and far less relaxing. Attendants had to clean and polish these tools daily, because nothing ruined a nobleman's morning like a rusty strigil. And yet, despite the exhaustion, there was a strange rhythm to it all. The attendants knew every sound of the bathhouse: the hiss of steam, the crackle of fire, the echo of dripping water in the marble halls. They were the unseen orchestra behind Rome's daily ritual of cleanliness and vanity. As dawn broke and the city began to stir, the attendants took a brief moment to breathe. The fires were steady, the pools shimmered invitingly, and the air was thick with the scent of olive oil and ambition. Soon, the doors would open, and the day's parade of senators, soldiers, poets, and gossips would begin. But for now, in the quiet before the chaos, the attendants stood in the mist, guardians of heat and water, masters of a world that would never remember their names. And somewhere, deep in the hypocaust, a small flame flickered, the heartbeat of Rome's most luxurious obsession. Chapter 1. The Steam Before Dawn Part 2. By the time the first light of morning spilled through the narrow windows of the Thermae, the attendants had already been awake for hours. Their bodies moved automatically now, guided by habit and the faint hope that the day's patrons might be generous with their tips, though generosity was not exactly a Roman virtue when it came to servants. The balneators were ghosts in the mist, their presence felt but rarely acknowledged. The bathhouse itself was a marvel of engineering and excess. The walls were lined with marble imported from distant provinces, Numidian yellow, Phrygian purple, and the prized white from Carrara. The floors were mosaics depicting gods, dolphins, and occasionally, scenes so scandalous that even the attendants pretended not to notice. Every tile, every column, every echoing arch was designed to remind visitors that Rome was not just a city. It was the center of the world, and the world was very fond of bathing. The attendants began their next task, preparing the oils. Romans did not use soap in the modern sense. Instead, they covered their bodies in oil, usually olive oil, sometimes mixed with herbs or perfumes, and then scraped it off with a strigil. The process removed dirt, sweat, and a fair amount of dignity. The attendants mixed the oils carefully, adding crushed lavender, rosemary, or even saffron for the wealthy patrons who wanted to smell like a garden rather than a goat. Each jar of oil was labeled according to its purpose. There was oil for athletes, thicker and more pungent, meant to loosen muscles after exercise. There was oil for senators, lighter and perfumed, meant to impress rather than cleanse. And then there was the cheap oil for the common folk, the kind that smelled faintly of olives and disappointment. As the attendants worked, they exchanged quiet jokes. Humor was their armor against exhaustion. One of them, a wiry man named Lucius, liked to say that the Thermae were the only place in Rome where everyone was equal, naked, sweaty, and pretending not to look at each other. Another, older attendant named Gaius, would reply that equality ended the moment someone dropped a coin into the tip jar. The first patrons arrived soon after sunrise. They came in groups, soldiers fresh from the barracks, merchants smelling of wine and ambition, and the occasional philosopher who claimed to bathe for clarity of thought. The attendants greeted them with polite nods, guiding them through the sequence of rooms: the apodyterium, changing room; the tepidarium, warm room; the caldarium, hot room; and finally, the frigidarium, cold plunge. The apodyterium was a place of chaos disguised as order. Patrons stripped off their tunics and handed them to attendants, who stored them in small niches along the walls. Theft was a constant concern, so the attendants had to keep a sharp eye on the clothing, not because they cared about the garments, but because an angry senator accusing them of stealing could end a career faster than a bad back. In the tepidarium, the air was warm and heavy with steam. This was the transition room, where the body adjusted to the heat before entering the caldarium. The attendants moved silently among the patrons, offering towels, adjusting the flow of water, and occasionally pretending not to hear the latest political gossip. The tepidarium was where secrets were whispered, alliances formed, deals struck, and reputations quietly destroyed. Then came the caldarium, the heart of the bathhouse. The heat here was intense, almost sacred. The marble benches glistened with condensation, and the air shimmered like a mirage. The attendants carried buckets of hot water, poured them into the pools, and stirred the steam with long-handled ladles. The sound of dripping water echoed like a heartbeat. It was in the caldarium that the attendants' skill truly shone. They had to maintain the perfect balance of heat and humidity, adjusting the fires below and the vents above. Too much heat, and the patrons would complain of dizziness. Too little, and they would mutter about incompetence. The attendants learned to read the room like a musician reads a score. Every sigh, every bead of sweat, every flicker of discomfort was a note in the symphony of steam. And then, of course, there was the frigidarium, The cold plunge was both a test of courage and a badge of honor. Patrons would emerge from the caldarium, their skin flushed and glistening, and then, with a gasp and a curse, dive into the icy water. The attendants stood by with towels, pretending not to smirk as grown men squealed like startled pigs. The frigidarium was also the most dangerous room in the bathhouse. The sudden change in temperature could shock the body, and there were stories, whispered among the attendants, of men who entered the cold pool and never came out. When that happened, the attendants had to carry the body out discreetly, wrap it in a towel, and hope that the family was too embarrassed to ask questions. By midday, the bathhouse was alive with noise. The splash of water, the murmur of conversation, the occasional shout of laughter. It was a symphony of civilization. The attendants moved through it all like shadows, unseen but essential. They refilled oil jars, replaced towels, and swept the floors with bundles of reeds. They were part of the rhythm, part of the ritual. And yet, beneath the surface of this daily routine, there were secrets. The attendants knew things, who met whom in the steam, which senator had debts, which general had scars he didn't want seen. The bathhouse was a place of cleansing, yes, but also of confession. The attendants were the silent witnesses of Rome's vanity and vice. As the sun climbed higher, the air grew thick with heat and perfume. The marble floors gleamed, the pools shimmered, and the attendants continued their endless dance. They were invisible, indispensable, and utterly forgotten. But in their quiet way, they held the pulse of the empire in their hands, the heartbeat of Rome, echoing through the steam. And somewhere, deep beneath the marble floors, the fires of the hypocaust roared on, feeding the warmth that made Rome's citizens feel immortal, if only for an afternoon. Chapter 1. The Steam Before Dawn Part 3. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the thermi had transformed into a living organism, breathing, sweating, murmuring. The air shimmered with heat, and the scent of olive oil, incense, and ambition hung thick enough to taste. The attendants, though exhausted, moved with the precision of men who had long ago surrendered to routine. They were the quiet pulse beneath the marble skin of Rome's luxury. Lucius, the wiry attendant with a sharp tongue and sharper sense of irony, was crouched near the furnace, feeding the hypocaust with another armful of wood. His tunic was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his lungs filled with smoke. "If the gods truly loved us," he muttered, "they'd invent a bath that heats itself." Gaius, the older attendant, chuckled from across the room. "If the gods loved us, Lucius, we wouldn't be the ones doing the heating." The hypocaust was the heart of the bathhouse, but it was also its most dangerous secret. The attendants knew every creak of the bricks, every hiss of escaping steam. They knew that one misplaced log, one crack in the flue, could turn the entire system into a furnace fit for Vulcan himself. There were stories, whispered among the balneators, of bathhouses that had collapsed in fire, of attendants who vanished into smoke and were remembered only as those poor souls who kept the water warm. Above them, the patrons lounged in blissful ignorance. Senators debated politics while being massaged with perfumed oils. Merchants bragged about their profits, their voices echoing off the marble walls. Soldiers compared scars, poets recited verses, and philosophers pretended not to notice the slaves carrying their towels. The thermi were a microcosm of Rome itself, a place where power, vanity, and sweat mingled freely. The attendants, meanwhile, were invisible. They moved through the rooms like shadows, their presence acknowledged only when something went wrong. A towel too rough, a pool too cold, a whisper overheard. Any of these could bring a scolding or worse. Yet, in their invisibility, they saw everything. They knew which senator's mistress visited at noon, which general's wounds were not from battle, and which philosopher's wisdom dissolved the moment he stepped into the caldarium. Lucius often joked that the thermi were the true senate of Rome, because at least here everyone's naked and honest. Gaius would shake his head, muttering that honesty was the first thing to evaporate in the steam. The attendants' midday meal was brief and unremarkable. A crust of bread, a handful of olives, maybe a sip of watered wine if fortune smiled. They ate in a small alcove near the furnace, where the heat was unbearable but the company tolerable. Conversation drifted between complaints and gossip. One attendant spoke of a new therme being built across the city, rumored to have marble imported from Egypt. Another mentioned a patron who tipped with a coin so worn it might have been minted under Julius Caesar himself. "Do you ever think," Lucius asked between bites, "that will be remembered? That someone someday will tell our story?" Gaius snorted. "Remembered? My friend, the only thing they'll remember is how clean their backsides were. History doesn't care who boiled the water." But Lucius wasn't convinced. He had a restless mind, the kind that refused to accept invisibility. He watched the patrons with a mixture of envy and amusement, wondering what it must feel like to live a life where others bowed and scraped. Yet, he also saw their fragility, the way they clung to rituals, to appearances, to the illusion of control. In the steam, everyone looked the same. Sweat blurred the lines between master and servant, noble and slave. For a few fleeting moments, the empire's hierarchy melted away. As the afternoon wore on, the bathhouse grew louder. The palestra, the exercise courtyard, filled with grunting athletes wrestling, throwing discus, and showing off muscles that would later be soothed in the caldarium. The attendants stationed there had the unenviable task of cleaning up after them, scraping sweat and oil from the marble floors. The smell was memorable. Inside, the tepidarium became a social theater. Patrons reclined on benches, discussing everything from politics to poetry to the latest scandal involving a senator's wife and a particularly handsome gladiator. The attendants pretended not to listen, but of course they did. Information was a kind of currency, and in the therme, the attendants were the bankers of gossip. One day, a young nobleman named Marcus entered the baths with the swagger of someone who had never worked a day in his life. He demanded the finest oil, the hottest water, and the most attentive service. Lucius, assigned to him, complied with a smile that was equal parts politeness and mockery. Marcus prattled on about his recent victory in the Senate, a speech, apparently, that had moved the hearts of men. Lucius nodded, thinking that the only thing Marcus had likely moved was his own reflection. When Marcus finally entered the caldarium, he complained that the water was too hot, then moments later that it was too cold. Lucius adjusted the temperature with exaggerated care, muttering under his breath, "Perhaps the gods themselves should attend to your bath, my lord." Marcus didn't hear him, of course. Patrons rarely did. But not all patrons were fools. Some were kind, or at least curious. An older woman named Livia, known for her sharp wit and sharper tongue, often spoke to the attendants as if they were human beings. She asked questions about the fires, the oils, the endless labor behind the luxury. Lucius found her fascinating. "You see more than most," she told him once. "You see Rome as it truly is, stripped bare." He wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. As evening approached, the crowds began to thin. The wealthy patrons departed first, their bodies gleaming, their egos freshly polished. The common folk lingered, savoring the last warmth before returning to their cramped homes. The attendants began the long process of cleaning, draining pools, scrubbing floors, extinguishing lamps. The bathhouse, once alive with noise, slowly fell silent. In the fading light, Lucius stood by the frigidarium, watching the ripples fade across the cold water. The marble walls glowed faintly in the twilight, and the air was heavy with the scent of extinguished fires. He thought of the day's labor, the endless heat, the laughter, the secrets whispered in steam. He thought of how the bathhouse was both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where Rome revealed its beauty and its absurdity in equal measure. Gaius joined him, leaning on a broom. "Another day done," he said. Lucius nodded. "Another day forgotten." "Good," Gaius replied. "Some days are better left that way." But as they turned to leave, a faint sound echoed from the depths of the hypocaust. A low, rhythmic thump, like a heartbeat beneath the stone. Lucius paused, frowning. "Did you hear that?" Gaius shrugged. "Probably the fire settling, or the gods complaining about the smell." Lucius smiled, but the sound lingered in his mind. The heartbeat of the therme, steady, ancient, and alive. That night, As the attendants finally rested in their cramped quarters behind the furnace, the bathhouse slept too. The fires dimmed, the water stilled, and the marble cooled. But beneath it all, the hypocaust whispered, a reminder that even in silence, Rome's heart never truly stopped beating. And somewhere in the darkness, Lucius dreamed of steam rising over marble, of laughter echoing through the halls, and of a secret buried deep beneath the baths. A secret waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 1. The Steam Before Dawn Part 4. The next morning began as all mornings did, with the hiss of steam, the crackle of fire, and the groan of men who had slept too little and worked too much. The Thermae was still cloaked in darkness, the marble floors cold beneath bare feet, the air heavy with the scent of ash and damp stone. Lucius stirred first, rubbing his eyes and muttering something unflattering about the gods of early mornings. Gaius was already awake, sitting by the furnace, poking at the embers like a priest tending a sacred flame. "Up, boy," Gaius said without looking up. "The fires won't feed themselves." Lucius groaned. "If they did, we'd be out of work." Which, come to think of it, doesn't sound so bad. The attendants began their ritual of preparation. The hypocaust had to be coaxed back to life, the fires stoked until the air beneath the floors shimmered with heat. The sound of crackling would fill the chamber, mingling with the rhythmic splash of water being poured into the basins above. The Thermae was waking, stretching its marble limbs, ready to receive the day's parade of humanity. Lucius worked in silence for a while, his mind wandering. The strange sound from the night before, that faint rhythmic thump, still echoed in his memory. He had told himself it was nothing, just the settling of stone or the sigh of cooling pipes, but something about it had felt alive. He decided not to mention it to Gaius again. The old man had enough ghosts of his own. By the time the first light crept through the high windows, the attendants were already drenched in sweat. The fires roared, the pools shimmered, and the air grew thick with warmth. The Thermae was ready. Soon, the doors would open, and the city would pour in. Senators, soldiers, merchants, slaves, all seeking the same thing. A moment of comfort in a world that demanded too much. The first to arrive that morning was a group of soldiers, their armor clinking as they entered the apodyterium. They laughed loudly, boasting of battles and women, their voices echoing off the marble walls. Lucius and the others helped them undress, storing their tunics and sandals in neat rows. The soldiers tossed coins into the attendants' baskets. Small tips, but enough to buy bread later. One of them, a young man with a scar across his cheek, winked at Lucius. "Keep the water hot, friend. We've got the chill of Germania still in our bones." Lucius smiled. "The fires of Rome will burn it out of you soon enough." As the soldiers moved into the tepidarium, the bathhouse began to fill. The rhythm of the day took hold. The steady flow of patrons, the murmur of conversation, the splash of water. The attendants moved like dancers, each step practiced, each gesture precise. They carried oils, towels, and strigils, their movements synchronized with the pulse of the Thermae itself. In the caldarium, the heat was already intense. The marble walls glistened, and the air shimmered like a mirage. Lucius adjusted the vents, letting in just enough air to keep the patrons from fainting. He watched as the soldiers sank into the steaming pool, their laughter turning to sighs of relief. For a moment, even warriors looked like children again, vulnerable, content, human. Gaius joined him, wiping sweat from his brow. "You ever notice," he said, "how everyone looks the same in the steam? Doesn't matter if they're senators or slaves. The heat strips it all away." Lucius nodded. "Maybe that's why they come here, to forget who they are for a while." Gaius chuckled. "Or to remember who they wish they were." The day wore on. The Thermae became a world unto itself. A place where time slowed, where the outside noise of the city faded into the hum of water and whispers. The attendants moved through it all, unseen but essential. They were the keepers of balance, the guardians of comfort. And yet, beneath the surface, something stirred. It began with small things. A faint vibration beneath the floor. a flicker of light in the furnace that didn't belong to fire. Lucius noticed it first while feeding the hypocaust. The air seemed to hum, a low, steady sound that resonated in his chest. He paused, listening. It was the same rhythm he had heard the night before, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat. "Gaius," he called softly. "Come here." The old man shuffled over, squinting into the shadows. "What is it now? Another rat?" "Listen." They stood in silence. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a deep, pulsing thump, echoing through the stone. Gaius frowned. "Probably the pipes. The water pressure changes when the upper pools fill." Lucius shook his head. "No, it's too regular, too alive." Gaius gave him a look that was half amusement, half warning. "Careful, boy. The last thing we need is another ghost story. The Thermi has enough of those." But Lucius couldn't shake the feeling. As he worked, he found himself listening for the sound, waiting for it. Came and went, sometimes faint, sometimes strong, always just beyond understanding. The other attendants noticed his distraction. "You look like you've seen a spirit," one of them joked. Lucius forced a laugh. "If I have, it's probably just another patron who forgot to pay." By evening, the bathhouse was quieter. The crowds had thinned, the fires burned lower, and the air cooled. Lucius lingered near the frigidarium, staring at the still water. The marble walls reflected the flickering lamplight, casting strange shadows that danced like ghosts. He thought again of the heartbeat beneath the stone. What if it wasn't just the pipes? What if something ancient lay beneath the Thermi, something older than Rome itself? He remembered a story Gaius had told once, half in jest, half in warning. "They say the first baths were built over sacred springs," the old man had said. "Places where the gods themselves bathed. The water was said to have power, healing, cleansing, even divine. But when men built their marble temples over it, the gods grew silent. Or angry." Lucius smiled at the memory, but unease lingered. He knelt by the edge of the pool, dipping his hand into the cold water. It was perfectly still, perfectly ordinary. And yet, as his fingers brushed the surface, he felt it again. That faint vibration, pulsing through the stone, through the water, through him. He pulled his hand back quickly, glancing around. The bathhouse was empty now, the silence deep and heavy. The fires crackled softly in the distance. He told himself it was nothing, just the echo of his own heartbeat, amplified by the stone. But deep down he wasn't sure. That night, as the attendants settled into their quarters, Lucius lay awake, listening. The sound was faint but constant, a slow, steady rhythm beneath the floor. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore it, but it seemed to grow louder, closer, until it filled his mind. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, ancient and patient, waiting in the dark. And as sleep finally claimed him, he dreamed of water, endless, shimmering water, and of something moving beneath it, vast and unseen, breathing in time with the heartbeat of the Thermi. Chapter 1. The Steam Before Dawn, Part 5. The next day began with a strange stillness, the kind of silence that feels heavy, as if the air itself is holding its breath. The Thermi was never truly quiet. Even before dawn, there was always the crackle of fire, the drip of water, the shuffle of feet. But that morning, the attendants noticed it immediately. The fires burned lower than usual, the water in the basins seemed sluggish, and the familiar hum of the hypocaust was muted, as though the great furnace beneath the marble had grown tired. Lucius woke with a start, his dreams still clinging to him like mist. He had dreamed again of water, dark, endless water, and of something vast moving beneath it. He sat up, rubbing his temples, trying to shake the image. Gaius was already awake, sitting by the furnace with a cup of watered wine, staring into the embers. "You look like you've seen Pluto himself," Gaius said without turning. Lucius forced a laugh. "If I had, I'd ask him for a day off." "Careful what you wish for," Gaius muttered. "The gods have a sense of humor." They began their morning routine, but something felt off. The fires were reluctant to catch, the wood damp despite being stored indoors. The attendants muttered among themselves, blaming the weather, the wood, or the whims of Vulcan. Lucius said nothing. He kept glancing toward the floor, half expecting to hear that faint, rhythmic thump again. But there was only silence. As the morning wore on, the thermi came to life once more. Patrons arrived, shedding their togas and worries at the door. The attendants moved through the familiar motions, heating the pools, mixing the oils, adjusting the vents. The rhythm of the day resumed, but beneath it all Lucius felt a tension, like a string pulled too tight. In the caldarium, the heat was oppressive. The marble walls glowed with moisture, and the air shimmered. Lucius stood by the furnace vent, adjusting the flow of air. He could feel the vibration of the hypocaust beneath his feet, faint but steady. He told himself it was normal, the pulse of the fires, the breath of the bathhouse. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he could almost hear it again. That slow, deliberate heartbeat. "Lucius!" Gaius's voice snapped him back. "You're daydreaming again. The patrons are complaining the water's too cool." Lucius nodded, forcing a smile. "Then let's make it hot enough to melt their complaints." He stoked the fire, feeding it until the flames roared. The heat surged through the vents, and the marble floor trembled slightly. The patrons sighed in satisfaction, unaware of the sweat and soot that made their comfort possible. By midday, the thermi was crowded. The palestra echoed with the sounds of athletes. The tepidarium buzzed with gossip, and the frigidarium rang with the gasps of those brave enough to plunge into its icy depths. The attendants moved like clockwork, their bodies aching but their minds numb from repetition. Only Lucius seemed distracted, his eyes flicking toward the floor whenever the faintest vibration passed through the stone. During a brief lull, he found himself alone near the furnace. The others had gone to fetch more wood, leaving him in the dim, smoky chamber. The air was thick, the heat suffocating. He crouched by the vent, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, just the crackle of fire and the hiss of steam. Then, faintly, it came again. Thump, thump, thump. Slow, steady, alive. Lucius leaned closer, his heart pounding in rhythm with the sound. He pressed his hand to the floor. The stone was warm, almost hot, but beneath the heat he could feel it. A pulse, deep and deliberate. He drew back quickly, his breath catching. The sound faded, swallowed by the roar of the furnace. When Gaius returned, Lucius said nothing. He didn't know how to explain it without sounding mad. The old man would laugh, tell him it was the pipes, the pressure, the imagination of a tired mind. And maybe it was. But as the day wore on, Lucius couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the thermi was stirring. That evening, after the last patrons had left and the fires were banked, Lucius lingered in the caldarium. The air was still warm, the marble glistening in the lamplight. He walked slowly around the pool, his footsteps echoing softly. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the flicker of the lamps like liquid gold. He knelt by the edge, staring into the depths. The surface trembled slightly, though there was no breeze, no movement. He reached out, touching the water. It was warm, almost comforting. But as his fingers brushed the surface, a ripple spread outward, slow, deliberate, unnatural. He froze. The ripple reached the edge of the pool, then returned, as if something beneath had answered his touch. Lucius pulled his hand back, heart racing. He looked around, but the room was empty. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. He stood, backing away from the pool. The ripple faded, the water still once more. He told himself it was nothing. A trick of the light, a shift in the temperature. But deep down, he knew better. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound haunted him, that slow, steady heartbeat beneath the stone. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. The others snored softly around him, oblivious. The fire in the furnace crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, came the sound. Thump, thump, thump. He sat up, heart pounding. The sound was louder now, closer. He looked toward the floor, half expecting to see it tremble. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the very walls were holding their breath. He stood, moving quietly toward the furnace room. The corridor was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the embers. As he entered the furnace chamber, the heat hit him like a wave. The fires burned low, casting long, shifting shadows. The sound was louder here, echoing through the stone. He crouched by the vent, listening. Thump, thump, thump. It was no longer faint. It was strong, insistent, alive. Lucius swallowed hard. "Who's there?" he whispered, feeling foolish the moment the words left his mouth. The only answer was the crackle of fire. He leaned closer, his hand hovering over the vent. The heat was intense, but he could feel it, the vibration, the pulse. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a heartbeat. He drew back, his mind racing. Could it be the water pressure? The flow from the aqueducts? Some mechanical rhythm of the hypocaust? He wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that. But the sound was too steady, too alive. He stayed there for a long time, listening until the sound began to fade. When it was gone, he sat back, exhausted. The fire crackled softly, the air thick with smoke. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing thoughts. When he finally stood to leave, he glanced once more at the vent. For a moment, he thought he saw something. A flicker of light deep within the furnace, like a reflection on water. Then it was gone. The next morning, Lucius said nothing to the others. The day began as usual: fires, water, patrons, noise. The rhythm of the thermi resumed, steady and familiar. But beneath it all, he could still feel it, that faint, steady pulse, like the heartbeat of something ancient and unseen, waiting in the depths below. And as the steam rose once more, curling through the marble halls, Lucius couldn't help but wonder. What if the thermi was alive? What if the warmth, the water, the endless rhythm of fire and steam? What if it all had a heart of its own? Chapter 1. The Steam Before Dawn, Part 6. The morning after the strange heartbeat had faded into silence, the thermi seemed to breathe again. The fires caught easily, the water flowed clear, and the attendants moved through their routines with the weary grace of men who had long ago surrendered to repetition. Yet for Lucius, every sound, every vibration beneath the marble, carried a new weight. He listened for the pulse that had haunted him, half hoping to hear it again, half terrified that he would. The city outside was already stirring. From the open vents above came the distant clatter of carts, the cries of vendors, the faint hum of Rome awakening. Inside, the thermi was its own world, a world of heat and water, of murmured gossip and echoing footsteps. The attendants were its unseen priests, tending to their sacred fires, keeping the ritual alive. Lucius joined Gaius near the furnace, the air thick with smoke and the scent of burning pine. The old man was humming softly, a tune older than either of them could remember. "You're quiet this morning," Gaius said without looking up. Lucius shrugged. "Didn't sleep well. Dreams again." "Something like that." Gaius chuckled. "Dreams are for those who can afford them. The rest of us have work." They fed the fires in silence. The hypocaust roared to life, sending waves of heat through the stone pillars beneath the floors. The sound was comforting in its familiarity. The crackle of wood, the hiss of steam, the low hum of the furnace. Lucius focused on the rhythm, trying to lose himself in it. But beneath the noise, he thought he heard something else. A faint echo, a whisper of that same heartbeat, distant but persistent. He shook his head, forcing the thought away. The day had only just begun, and already his mind was playing tricks on him. By mid-morning, the thermi was alive with activity. Patrons filled the rooms, their voices blending into a steady murmur. The attendants moved among them, carrying oils, towels, and strigils, their movements practiced and precise. The caldarium shimmered with heat, the tepidarium glowed softly in the lamplight, and the frigidarium waited, cold and still, for the brave or the foolish. Lucius worked in the tepidarium that day, adjusting the vents and refilling the oil jars. The patrons were in good spirits, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. He listened absently to their conversations. Politics, trade, gossip, the endless chatter of Rome's elite. It was strange, he thought, how the same men who argued in the Senate could sit here naked, sweating side by side, pretending to be equals. The steam made everyone human, if only for an hour. As he moved through the room, he caught sight of Livia, the sharp-tongued noblewoman who often visited in the afternoons. She was reclining on a marble bench, her hair pinned up, her eyes half closed. When she saw Lucius, she smiled faintly. "You look troubled, attendant. Has the heat melted your thoughts?" Lucius bowed slightly. "Only the unnecessary ones, my lady." "Good. Rome would be quieter if more men did the same." She gestured toward the pool. "Tell me, do you ever tire of this place? The endless steam, the endless chatter?" Lucius hesitated. "It's familiar. There's comfort in that." "Comfort," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Or captivity." He didn't answer. She smiled again, a knowing smile, and turned her gaze back to the water. "Be careful, Lucius. The Thermi has a way of keeping secrets. Some of them prefer to stay buried." Her words lingered long after she left. That evening, as the last patrons departed and the attendants began their cleaning, Lucius found himself drawn once more to the furnace room. The fires were low, the air thick with the scent of ash. He crouched by the vent, listening. For a long time, there was nothing, just the crackle of dying flames. Then, faintly, it came again. Thump, thump, thump. He closed his eyes, his breath shallow. The sound was softer now, almost gentle, like the heartbeat of something sleeping. He pressed his hand to the floor. The stone was warm, pulsing faintly beneath his palm. He stayed like that for a long time, listening until the sound faded once more into silence. When he finally stood, he noticed something strange. The air near the furnace shimmered, as if the heat had taken on a life of its own. He stepped closer, squinting through the haze. For a moment he thought he saw shapes, faint outlines moving within the steam. Figures, perhaps, or shadows. He blinked and they were gone. He told himself it was the light, the exhaustion, the tricks of a tired mind. But as he turned to leave, he heard a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, carried on the breath of the furnace. A single word in Latin, ancient and unfamiliar. He couldn't make it out, but it sent a chill through him that no amount of heat could dispel. That night, sleep came fitfully. His dreams were filled with water and fire, with marble halls that stretched into infinity. He saw the Thermi as it had been centuries ago, new, gleaming, filled with laughter and light. But beneath it, he saw something else. Tunnels, chambers, and a vast, dark pool that pulsed like a living heart. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the echo of that heartbeat still in his ears. The next day, he tried to lose himself in work. The routine helped, the fires, the water, the endless rhythm of labor. But the unease remained. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way the steam seemed to move against the air, the faint tremor in the marble beneath his feet, the way the water in the pool sometimes rippled without cause. The other attendants noticed nothing. Or perhaps they did and chose not to speak of it. One afternoon, while cleaning the frigidarium, Lucius found something unusual. Near the edge of the pool, where the marble met the water, a small crack had appeared, thin, almost invisible but deep. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the faint vibration beneath. It was the same rhythm, the same pulse. He drew back quickly, glancing around. The room was empty, the water was still, but the crack remained, a silent reminder that something beneath the Thermi was shifting. He told Gaius about it later, careful to sound casual. The old man frowned. Cracks happen. The heat, the water, the years. Marble isn't immortal, no matter what the architects say. Lucius nodded, but said nothing more. He knew the difference between the wear of time and the whisper of something alive. That evening, as the attendants finished their work, Lucius lingered once more by the furnace. The fires burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. He crouched by the vent, listening. The heartbeat was there, faint but steady. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. It was no longer frightening. It was almost comforting, like the pulse of the city itself, ancient and eternal. He thought of Livia's words, "The Thermi has a way of keeping secrets." Perhaps this was one of them. Perhaps the heartbeat was not a warning, but a memory. The echo of all who had passed through these halls, their laughter, their whispers, their lives absorbed into the stone. As he stood to leave, he looked back at the furnace one last time. The flames flickered, casting shapes on the walls. Fleeting, ghostly shapes that seemed to move with purpose. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Good night, old heart," he whispered. "Keep burning." The Thermi slept once more, its fires dim, its waters still. Outside, the city of Rome pulsed with life, carts rumbling, voices rising, the endless rhythm of empire. And beneath it all, deep within the marble and stone, the heartbeat continued, slow, steady, eternal.